Hello, Ebusia. Yati say Chief Justice obi ne file a petition at the command and Kufuado beginning December no more. Na Kufuado G no see enyina so bi enim I was me proceeding with this. The same person answered the same petition and the brave President John Dramani Mahama or no dia waje asomu no enam so emo dia remove the Chief Justice no or the suspending no a formal committee from Council of States 5 members a body are appointing new interim Chief Justice I friend no Bafo Boni so no na so na yenye investigation emfenhwehwe ma mi nsemimu ebusia eba ne sei na nia na Kufuado anje no President Muhammad ono age akasa all substantial evidence papa na akasa o file case no na akasa waba be kana sem waba be ka ne ntia e ma ne file sa case no ebusia and then answer and a demonstration can see because of Ghana. Led by NPP. Now NPP say only all the parties, political parties of Ghana and organizes that demonstration against the suspension of the Chief Justice, Justice Gertrude Tokono. Mwamuni masemne so dada say Chief Justice Tokono asemi starti yeno ache December num and now it's Professor be the Professor Azar, Professor Kweku Asari, so US based or file a petition against Chief Justice or the command and Kufuado. Now say on the Chief Justice position, a Chief Justice are appointed by the sitting president. However, that presidential office should not have much control or should not meddle with the affairs of the Chief Justice, because a hono stands as the justice hem of the whole of Ghana. Nti number be di asem e Ghana. And he say more political parties no influence ko hono ma wanya na e ba be partisan. Nti meaning wo baswa and would Chief Justice nam. To ko di asem bia how and na yebetimi Chief Justice ebetimi apanish because one are any buy. And I say because wo can be mano or wo favor no. No person can say Chief Justice Tokono, which I can say maybe NDC4 are saying Chief Justice Tokono obedi so no say Kufuado na appointing favor Kufuado no monko to the point where me say baby say I think that Kevin Taylor was making a yibi say Chief Justice Papa Wuye afenyo markings fie no kokoye reception na was a Chief Justice mo choose one party panyi bia kokoye reception with fie asembe na be ma watimi akaso mo ye boni bia to the point where afenyo markings ni girlfriend bi ni Emma ehun asem say girlfriend no ni ku agyae okrankwara mienu ema afenyo markins sensem bebre say custody battles bi ni nyamanyama afenyo markins hu kokodi asem ni bi mra na anyway asem ni de I think say mo amunim Kevin Taylor ne kan yem some krama kan o me han mo say pen so asem no na afenyo markins was dating a lady bia ne matu ne man no ni ku no ne share e man no custody na lady no according to Kevin Taylor Seminole lady in the details I'm reading and lady no brother sexual like say abuse nkwara no ko catch on papa ko file case no court na case no court no represent a yere no eye Afenyo Markins office na represent a yere no to the point where Afenyo Markins no mu ko kidnap abofra no e ma nsem no sanse no mu ye no katasumbu mu aso nti na ma papa yi a ye nkwara ne ma papa no e di asem no e ko Supreme Court a Chief Justice e kokot na so it seems say Chief Justice Kevin Taylor ne no kan so say Chief Justice e kan no basa bi e ma ewi achi no apology letter bi pe e no ma Afenyo Markins no mo e tro de kokopa Abranti ne chew e wa mra na e was say sexual abuse case e won kwaranketenkete dey it should have gone higher than that. Nina goes to show say Judge Tokonu was supporting the NDC, MPP was favoring the MPP. Anyway, Busian, fast forward today, December 17th, when Professor Azar or Professor Kwekwasari filed a petition say Judge Tokonu and some no or baby awotino on snaho ye because and some no ondini ye was her conduct were wrong and also she was being incompetent. Na Ekokoba president eje no say we just have petition now. You have to share na say what president no say we gidi say asem no am passing ni nyina so no asem no details won bebre na am pass we dey yempa nhwem a utimi set Council of State impenyophobia on be yes investigation no na ekodu sa petition kokodu president Akufo-Addo no de no je yape ohwe ma no say masa mbache wasem ni nyina so bia meaning there's no prima facie I think nyina so no ebe ma president Eddie Akokoma Council of State for no and no your friend prima facie no to say this not substantial. There's no substantial evidence I prove say Chief Justice no has been incompetent or her conduct were not right. Enti se mo hwe ya Akufo-Addo ese da bi enti or reject sa petition no sa petition na papa yi sa file ye edekokoma president bio and them say other petitions bi so keka ho edekokoma president Mahama dey say no ye NDC na nyo no appoint Tokonu nti ono no osom ape and na o say no there is a prima facie evidence into meaning there's an evidence that is substantial enough to make us move up, make us go ahead with an investigation. And to going ahead with an investigation, and no, say one would say akunyana so no. See about the investigation, that's all that want to hold ya. Say enye yesa, and tieni na wonu free ho. Let me mouse suspension. I'm pretty sure suspension will pay. Because if you na do pay whilst the investigation is going on. The investigation ye hwemu na say yampa say nia petition na anybody can file a petition. The petition na papa ini nkrofo dia ba no ampa say I'm passing you demonstrated say you were incompetent. Well, yeah, when needs and 70 years, if you have when dinner year and 3 years, then your man, not just you wedding. O man finance as na say we dey ka say nya dia but nya too much be yi papa ma me dia na no so na ke so maka na Council of State for na ka na President Mahama ekipu ma me ewo so ebusia enti no na akwakofa sema ba MPP for say yenti bi da adan na wo remove adan na wo suspend maame no and adan na wo suspend maame no na enti ekwo demonstration because you are infringing on the freedom and the justice of the Ghanaian people as a whole and also na NDC for say there be but he say baba resetting crew no we campaign on the ticket of resetting Ghana. We are tackling corruption and everything else. I say most so muagasa na who say NPP4 were heavily corrupted. And that and no dear and yet I don't think say NDC for the kanikasi. However, it's been evident and nunti na NPP4 supporters be na kwanko twama NPP ntema NPP ewe ebusia nti Mahama so say me mama menent na hono e wa mra ye change Ghana, ye reset Ghana because Mama no seems say she sat there whilst all these alleged corruption in our course. Inti manent na hono sa. Inti seems say he is working his way to remove that woman. And kofo be brain so I challenge papa na Kweku Asare na or file a petition. Say about saying a President Akufo-Addo ka say would there no evidence be any na President Mahama agye watena ho no mu a wanka hwe afei na oba be kasa say obema the reasons entia or file ye. Now the reason ne woman very very substantial because it provide all the evidence to who the intia and ekufo one source asem ebusiamu nyenko tie Professor Azar ninchechi mu no ewa by the hona tie se na be ya obeti ase ye se na be ya obehu nia ekoso in the judiciary system no.
Many people, many media people tried to call me to come on air, and I refused because I respected the privacy of the proceedings as articulated in by Dateba in the Ajay case. So this is the first time that I'm actually coming on TV to say something about this petition, which I thought was poorly handled. Now, you talk about my petition did not have evidence and so on. This is false. I not only had facts, but I provided dates, events, and I also indicated witnesses that I was going to bring along during the inquiry phase to substantiate the allegations that I was making. Because when you submit a petition to a president, you are not attaching evidence, because the president is not a trier of fact. You are submitting enough to let the president decide whether or not there's enough in there to push the matter to a body that can inquire into it. Okay, so when I come in there and I say, look, the Chief Justice, and before I even say that, let me acknowledge that, look, the removal of a Chief Justice is a grave matter. I certainly will never be part of any attempt to remove a Chief Justice unless I was absolutely convinced that there was a good reason to do that. Second, people often talk about judicial independence, and I agree with everything that they say about judicial independence, except when they talk about judicial independence, they are always talking about institutional independence, for the executive trying to intrude into the affairs of the judiciary. That is one facet of independence. But there's also decisional independence. And in decisional independence, the Chief Justice or any person can interfere with the proper or independent functioning of a judge or a judicial body. That is decisional independence. And that was the basis of my petition, that the Chief Justice had unconstitutionally inserted herself into the naming of Supreme Court justices. There's a very good reason that when you read the Constitution, it doesn't include the Chief Justice in this process, because the Supreme Court is supposed to be a court of equals. Every member of the court is an equal. The Chief Justice is the chief, largely because she also performs administrative functions. But when it comes to their judging, deciding cases, each panel member has one vote. Each panel member is an equal. And you can see the mayhem and the bedlam if indeed judges started coming to believe that they have to play ball with the Chief Justice, because the Chief Justice has a role in whether or not they are going to sit on the Supreme Court. It was unconstitutional and the gravest breach of our Constitution for the Chief Justice to name specific justices and write to the President, unknown to us until the letter was leaked, that I want A, B, C, D, E to be appointed to the Supreme Court. Why A, B, C, D, E? And look at the embarrassment that you bring to some of the judges who you've named, because some of the judges were actually sitting on political sensitive cases at the time. And to name them gives the appearance that the executive and the judiciary are in cahoot to promote people who are sitting on political sensitive cases. So that was a serious breach. And that was the only reason I filed the petition, it gives me no joy whatsoever. In fact, it's painful that I would submit a petition for the removal of a Chief Justice. But where the Chief Justice gives me no option by involving himself or herself in the naming of Supreme Court justices, that's just one leg of my petition. The second leg was in the reconstitution of panels that have already started hearing cases. If you read the Constitution tells us that once a panel starts to hear a case, that panel cannot be changed. In fact, the Chief Justice has no administrative authority over that panel. He couldn't tell them, sit today, or I'm moving one person out of the panel, because if she did that, and if we allowed a Chief Justice to do that, the Chief Justice will be interfering with the decisional independence of court panels. I mentioned specific cases in which this had happened. I indicated in my petition that I'll bring Justice Jamafe to testify about these things. And then third, I raised the question of how decrees were being used to regulate the courts, contrary to the Constitution. The Constitution says, look, if you are going to issue any directives about how courts should operate, do that with a constitutional instrument, and it specifies an elaborate process. The reason for that elaborate process is because we don't have an imperial Chief Justice who can just do whatever she wants. The Chief Justice is subject to the Constitution, and if you want to if you want to come out with a rule, there's a rule-making process. You have to meet with the Judicial Council. You have to have a constitutional instrument. It has to be laid in Parliament. It has to take a certain number of days to ripen. And then once it ripens, it becomes the law. But the Chief Justice was on her own doing these things. And this is the reason why I got involved. And I thought that if that or those things that she was doing were not addressed in a very fundamental way, we stand the risk of allowing future Chief Justices to do that because of the precedent that had been set by her. There's a reason why from Redu through Aqua to Georgina Wood to Sophia Kufu to Ani Yeboah, none of them ever attempted to name somebody to the Supreme Court because they knew that was fatally and incurably flawed and wrong and unconstitutional and constitutes a violation of their oath of office. Do we know whether it is wrong, or by that petition are we saying that future Chief Justices can reconstitute panels? Are we saying that future Chief Justices can send names to a president on who to appoint? Why these particular justices, not others? I mean, on the Court of Appeal, we have very experienced and very astute justices. Sir Dennis, for instance, comes to mind. Why would a Chief Justice overlook Sir Dennis and go and suggest some other person who is Sir Dennis's junior, not just in terms of tenure, but in terms of accomplishments? If the Chief Justice is allowed to do that, can't people understand and appreciate the toxic culture that would have been introduced into the judiciary, where every member of the court will now be trying to please the Chief Justice, something that the constitutional framers were keenly aware of and did all they can to say, no, we are not that kind of institution where the Chief Justice decides who should be promoted. Rather, let's leave that to the political branches to decide who should get nominated to the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal and so on. It is a grievous violation of the Constitution. It doesn't happen anywhere. It is not a light matter. You see, one of the things that I think we get fixated about is if something does not involve money, then people cannot see that there's a big issue. They say, oh, well, but there's no money involved. There is no breach of the Constitution as serious as a Chief Justice becoming the person who combs the court and decide who should be appointed to the Supreme Court or who should be promoted. Once you allow that, you compromise incurably the independence of the judiciary, because now all the judges are trying to please the Chief Justice, because you know that if you get into her bad books, if you are not in her good books, she's never going to recommend you for promotion. And that is something that we want to avoid. Are we saying that, or is that President Akufo-Addo saying that he doesn't think a committee should inquire into why court panels are reconstituted to the protestation of the parties in the case, and often in a way that gives the hint of political, a political flavor? He doesn't think that is a serious thing. This, to me, was so fundamental that anybody who understands what a prima facie determination is will laugh when you read what was written in that. The Council of State, my uncle, I love Uncle Sam. I mean, I go to see him whenever I'm in Ghana and so on. He's very good to me. But he, before they determined the prima facie case, was out calling the petition stupidity. That's what he said. And you think the Council of State was independent in that determination? They are not independent. That was just some prefabricated determination, because any neutral panel would look at it and say, well, look, these allegations are serious. We don't know whether they warrant a removal or not. A committee should look into it, because the matters that have been raised are very fundamental to the health of the judiciary. And if we don't resolve them, we will create a precedent where future Chief Justices come in and then they start naming people to the Supreme Court. They start reconstituting panels. They start transferring people and so on. So I thought there should have been more outcry at the president's determination of no prima facie case.
In your petition?
And in my petition, yes. And in the current petition, where there is a prima facie determination, I mean, that makes sense, because the prima facie determination is such a low threshold that unless somebody is motivated by malice, they would make a good case. I mean, in my case, I had no malice. I don't have anything against the Chief Justice. In fact, I like the Chief Justice. And it pained me when she was doing some of those things. So as far back as maybe January 2024 or maybe later in 2023, I started making public announcements that these panel reconstitutions must stop. Justice Jamafe shown the red card, it's not good. Opuni judge transferred, it's not good. Imperial Chief Justice, stop. I made repeated efforts to get to her to stop some of the things that she was doing. It was only when I concluded that she was not going to stop and that I had a civic duty to intervene. That's when I filed the petition.
Ebusia, and some ya papa yi kayin. Moti asese ye ampa say evidence be brenu goes to show say maame no ase otewo no na so ye kataso mu so o favor NPP for nko adodo na mempo na mente yes the five justice appointees no na mente ye no so mpo na the constitution doesn't man ho kwan ya why na as a chief justice o kokko yes ebusia hye wadwen was asem ye ho should president remove the chief justice or maintain the chief justice?